Hey guys, it's TrashKat and welcome back to the Reading Room, the place where we discuss books, manga, comics, movies, anime, games, and whatever else I feel like talking about. Today we'll be talking about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'll be comparing the book to the movie. I'll also be taking a few minutes at the end to talk about the new TV show Ratched. If you hadn't figured it out by now, there will be spoilers for both the book, movie, and the TV show Ratched. I also wanted to add a content warning onto this video. The book and movie both contain discussions of mental illness, as well as outdated racist opinions and references. So if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, this story might not be for you. So let's move on to the review. We're going to start with the characters. The names and general personalities of the characters are the same between the book and the film, but there are certainly differences in their roles in the story. Before I talk about the main characters, I wanted to talk for a few seconds about some of the supporting characters. Strangely enough, this is actually one of Danny DeVito's first roles. Honestly, I didn't even recognize him. When I found out he was in this movie, I actually went back and tried to find him in the scenes that I had already watched. I know Danny DeVito from Matilda, and he doesn't look anything like that in this movie. Brad Dourif is also in this. I don't know if you guys know him from anything, but he plays that really nasty guy in Two Towers that literally nobody likes. This guy. So now, the biggest discrepancy between book and film is the main character, as in they're different characters altogether. Those who have seen the movie, I'm sure, are all too familiar with Jack Nicholson's role as Randall McMurphy. While the other characters are important, McMurphy is definitely the focal point. This is almost completely at odds with the book, which is narrated and told from the perspective of Chief. McMurphy can still arguably be called the main character, but the story is told by Chief. This switch of focus almost entirely changes the theme of the story, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Like I said before, the characters in and of themselves are very similar in both portrayals, but in my opinion, they're more shallow in the film, which is to be expected. I mean, we're talking about a 300-page book condensed into a 2-hour movie. There just isn't enough time to fully expand on every character that you would want to. The two biggest character differences that I had a problem with were Nurse Ratched and Chief. Nurse Ratched is famously listed as one of the best villains in film history. As in, she's in the top 5. I'll leave a link to the list in the description below if anyone's interested in checking that out. However, what is astounding to me is she's nowhere near as intimidating or ruthless in the film as she is in the book. For example, let me read you something. This is her introduction. This is the first time we ever see her in the book. Cue the dreamscape. I'm mopping near the ward door when a key hits it from the other side, and I know it's the big nurse by the way the lock works cleave to the key. She slides through the door with a gust of cold and locks the door behind her, and I see her fingers trail across the polished steel. Tip of each finger the same color as her lips. Funny orange. Like the tip of a soldering iron. Color so hot or so cold if she touches you with it, you can't tell which. She dips a nod at me as she goes past. I let the mop push me back to the wall and smile. She walks stiff. Then she sights those black boys. They're still down there together, mumbling to one another. They didn't hear her come on the ward. They sense she's glaring down at them now, but it's too late. Their faces bob apart, confused. She goes into a crouch and advances on where they're trapped in a huddle at the end of the corridor. She knows what they've been saying, and I can see she's furious, clean out of control. She's going to tear them limb from limb, she's so furious. She's swelling up. Swells till her back splitting out the white uniform, and she's let her arms section out long enough to wrap around the 3 of them 5-6 times. She looks around her with a swivel of her huge head. Nobody up to see, just old Broom Bromden, the half-breed Indian back there hiding behind his mop and can't talk to call for help. So she really lets herself go, and her painted smile twists, stretches to an open snarl, and she blows up bigger and bigger. Big as a tractor, so big I can smell the machinery inside the way you smell a motor pulling too big a load. I hold my breath and figure, my God, this time they're gonna do it. This time they let the hate build up too high and overload it, and they're gonna tear one another to pieces before they realize what they're doing. But just as she starts crooking those sectioned arms around them, and they go to ripping at her underside with the mop handles, all the patients start coming out of the dorms to check on what's the hullabaloo, and she has to change back before she's caught in the shape of her hideous real self. Okay, so come back down to earth, and let me show you how she appears in the film.
Good morning, Miss Ratched.
Good morning.
Good morning, Miss Ratched.
Do you see the difference? Do you see my problem? I said I'd talk about Ratched, the TV show, a little later. I'm just gonna mention it briefly here because even though the show has its own issues, take a look at this entrance. Now, I may be biased because obviously newer media portrayals are going to have a higher quality of filming. I'm not saying that makes them better because that by far is not true. However, I think the introduction of Nurse Ratched in the TV show fits the mood much better than it does in the film. So let's talk about her character specifically. Now, what follows is a major spoiler, and I'm not going to warn you again, so click away if you're not interested. For the entirety of the book, Nurse Ratched is pulling strings. She's manipulative and really personifies that angel of mercy role without being outwardly violent. Feels like she's constantly making the patients' lives harder on purpose. She's always trying to treat the patients on her ward, but it's clear she enjoys their suffering and watching them struggle with their illnesses. Now, saying this, I sort of questioned her intentions as I was reading the book. As I mentioned before, it's told from Chief's perspective, someone who has what I think is schizophrenia, meaning that what the Chief is narrating might not actually be the true reality. But really, what solidified Nurse Ratched as a true villain was this final climactic scene. When she finds Billy Bibbit with Candy, she immediately starts with making him feel guilty. She hides it behind sweet, caring words, but she's manipulating his emotions to make him feel low and so ashamed that he ultimately kills himself. In the book, it seems clear that she knew this was gonna happen. If she didn't think he'd kill himself, she surely knew that he would take some action against himself, whether to kill himself or to harm himself or whatever. She even turns to McMurphy afterwards and says, "First Charles Cheswick and now William Bibbit, I hope you're finally satisfied. Playing with human lives, gambling with human lives, as if you thought yourself to be a god." And this is the reason McMurphy attacks her, because now she's manipulating him to make him feel like Billy's death is his fault. The evidence that she's hurting the patients herself is finally too much to bear, and he snaps. In the movie, Nurse Ratched is absolutely horrified when she finds that Billy Bibbit has killed himself. She doesn't even interact with McMurphy during this scene, so him attacking her almost feels like a random crack of his psyche rather than her pushing him to his limit. This was the big event in the book, so it was a little disappointing seeing how they portrayed it in the film. And then of course we have Chief. The whole point of the book is that it's being told by an outside perspective, a story told from a limited and possibly unreliable source. How Chief sees things is usually unrealistic and fantastical, but other times it's almost all too real. So it feels like you're being asked the question, just because it isn't real, does that mean it's not true? Chief sees things that don't exist, but are we sure they don't? Or is he just seeing an over-exaggerated version of the world's true nature? Also, Chief's character is kneecapped in the movie. In the book, we're told a few pages in that Chief has been faking his deaf and dumbness. This way he can listen in on the staff, do whatever he wants, and people leave him alone. You don't discover Chief can actually hear until like the last 15 minutes of the movie, and honestly, I almost missed it. It's such an important part of the book, and it's just so easy to miss in the film that it is just bizarre to me. So this is the perfect segue into what I want to say about the story itself. The biggest difference is in the portrayal. We're getting the same basic story. Everyone's in the mental institution, McMurphy shows up and starts causing a ruckus with Nurse Ratched, and in the end, a tragedy happens. Billy Bibbit kills himself and McMurphy loses his mind. But we're just not seeing the story the same way. The problem with this is that it affects the whole feel of the story. Having the book narrated from Chief's perspective really makes you feel like you're inside his head, helps you experience a story from someone's perspective who is mentally ill, who hallucinates, who isn't always really sure what's going on. This is such a cool thing to see come out of the 60s. We are right on the verge of deinstitutionalization. People are really starting to question the humanity and the morality of mental institutes, looking into the barbarity of particular practices that happen behind closed doors. And this makes it all the more tragic when McMurphy ends up losing his mind, and not from his own doing. McMurphy is not crazy. In fact, many of the characters at the institution aren't. Many of them would have lived lives that, if anything, were unconventional, maladjusted maybe, and yet we see them being treated like those who are barely even conscious or self-aware. The tragedy of the book is seeing how an institution like the one Nurse Ratched is in charge of can make anyone insane. The movie, I think, tries to scrape the surface of this theme, but doesn't quite get it right, and it's trying. It's got the right tone, the right characters, the right actors. And just like the book, it's great to see a movie like this come out when it did. A time when talking about or having a mental illness was, and arguably still is, very stigmatized. But what the movie is lacking is that underlying narrative that pulls you in and feeds you the empathy for each one of the acutes. So the setup of this review is going to be shorter than most of my other ones, because I pretty much touched on it already. Obviously, there's the usual difference between a book and a movie. What I did enjoy about the movie was the casting choices. I still feel a little weird about Nurse Ratched, but I think that's more personal preference. Jack Nicholson does a perfect job of, I don't want to say carrying the film because that implies that it's bad, which it's not, but he is certainly the main acting force here. And we've got trademark Jack Nicholson here, just like we see him in The Shining or Tim Burton's Batman, and it's phenomenal. I mean, he won an Academy Award for this role. I'd say he's definitely more tame in this film because he's not actually playing a character who's insane, but it's still pretty early on in his career. If you want some proof on how good this movie actually is, despite my own criticisms, it is the second movie in history to win all 5 Academy Awards and has been listed as one of the best films by the National Film Registry. I mean, we're looking at some impressive awards here. So before we move on to the ratings, I just want to take a few seconds to mention the TV show Ratched. Really? Surprisingly enough, it almost doesn't feel connected at all. It seems only to be related in name and role only. The TV show is supposed to be a prequel to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, following Nurse Ratched's life before she ends up at this mental institution where Chief and McMurphy and all the other acutes are. However, there is a huge discrepancy in characterization here. I have nothing against Sarah Paulson. Actually, I really love her as an actress, but I'm not really too sure how I felt about this show. The first few episodes had good promise. We see Nurse Ratched as this absolutely ruthless character, and I loved it. She was out for herself. She was so manipulative and ahead of everyone else that it was just insane. Pardon the pun. But then around episode 4 or 5, I don't remember specifically, I feel like the show really changed tone. Hello? Can I help you? Hi. Why do you always do this when I'm recording? You never want to hang out with me. Ow, okay, that is my skin. The show focuses more on her relationships outside of the institution. And while I find nothing wrong with shows that explore the LGBTQ community, I felt like this was a little pushed. It didn't feel as genuine as it could have, for example, in The Haunting of Bly Manor, which we've talked about previously. So what's the final decision? For One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the book, we have 5 out of 5 screens. For One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the film, we have 7 out of 10 screams. And I want to caveat that rating because I feel like if I had watched the movie before I read the book, my rating would have been much, much higher. And because of these ratings, the book wins out for me in this case. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. Be sure to check the links in the description below for my Instagram account and my blog where you can see the full write-up for these reviews. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more episodes. This is TrashKat signing off.